Okay, thank you.
Hey, Daryl, we can hear you.
Can you hear us?
Not anymore.
Okay.
Can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, great. So allow me to, everybody here, allow me to present our speaker for this afternoon. This is Professor Donald Wagner. I have three bios in front of me, and I'm going to pick and choose and try to see how to put them all together. He is a graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary and McCormick Theological Seminary. He was director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Chicago North Park University. He served as national director of the Palestine Human Rights Campaign between 1980 and 89, and was director of the Middle East program for Mercy Corps International from 1990 to 1994. He was also the co-founder of Evangelicals for Middle East Understanding, and that is, I think, a project with the Middle East Council of Churches. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and he is the author of 5 books on Palestinian rights. We also had the honor to host you here at Nest on several occasions in Beirut, and so you are not a stranger to our community. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. We look forward to hearing from you on the question of Zionism and Christian Zionism, and how you would like to help us to understand this better. Thank you very much, Reverend Wagner. We look forward to listening to you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be in touch, and I remember Nest very, very well. I need to come back and see you again. So I'm going to try to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions, and I guess you'll moderate the questions at that time. Okay, next slide. What I propose to do is I'm going to begin with a few introductory remarks about why we should be concerned about this. Then I'll go into a little bit of the political and the historical context of Christian Zionism and its rise, and focus mainly on the 19th century. Then a few remarks toward a hermeneutic of justice, of how we can think about this as Christians. And then finally, what our response should be, a call to prophetic and solidarity actions. So first, let me give 5 reasons, and there could be more, about why we should be concerned about this issue. The first is that Christian Zionism presents a false interpretation of the gospel. It's a Western interpretation that really undermines the gospel of Jesus, and we need to go back to Jesus to critique it, as well as the Hebrew prophets. Second, Christian Zionism is a global phenomenon. It's mainly a British and a North American export to the world, but it's growing exponentially in Central and South America, in Africa. You will find it in pockets in the Middle East, in Asia, and it aligns itself with Christian nationalism and even Zionist nationalism. The Netanyahu government and the extremist settlers find great alliance from these friends. And that's the third issue. It really underscores the extremism of Israeli Zionism, and even is aligned closely with the settlement movement in the Netanyahu government. Fourth, Christian Zionism is dividing churches. Young people are finally waking up, and young evangelicals are a hopeful sign because they're critical of it, but it's undermining the gospel and how we are preaching and trying to hold our churches together and be responsive to justice questions. Finally, I will call it a theological heresy. A heresy is a partial truth that empties truth of its full content. And Christian Zionism is heretical in that sense. So we need the gospel of justice of Jesus and of the Hebrew prophets to bring us back to what we are called to do and to be. And the greatest danger is, as a heresy, it could lead us into idolatry, as we will see. Next slide, please. When the Gaza crisis, I will call it a genocide, happened, Munther Isaac, who's the pastor at Christmas Lutheran Church in Bethlehem, raised a number of the issues. Why is the Western Church silent in the face of genocide? And you may recall his Christmas sermon, which went viral. He said, "Where is Jesus? Where is God?" And he said, "Under the rubble. We find God in the suffering of the Palestinian people in the genocide in Gaza, with the children, the women, the elderly, the men who are civilians who are caught in this Israeli genocide. That's where we find God." But the churches have been silent. Even today, you find many churches who struggle even to call for a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire. And Christian Zionism plays a role in this. Next slide. So in addition to that silence, I'll just briefly mention a very complicated theological issue that's become political. You may have seen reports of the red heifers. Well, for decades, Christian Zionists in Florida, Arkansas, and Texas, farmers have been trying to breed a pure red heifer in cooperation with extremist settlers in the West Bank. And they have finally done so. So there are 5 red heifers now who have been brought into Israel who are in a settlement, I think it's Ariel. And the settlers say that if we have a pure red heifer that's 3 years old, without a black or white hair, that's completely red, that will be perfect to create the sacrifice to reinstate Levitical sacrifices on the Temple Mount and to restore the building of the third temple. And this is a sign that many of them are claiming. It is now the time where we can remove by force, by whatever means, Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock and build the third temple. And of course, if this happens, this will bring on World War III. But there is the interplay between Christian Zionists, extremist settlers, with the passing support of the Israeli government. And it involves members of the U.S. Congress who are supporting this move. Next slide. So these are just a few of the issues that we see that raise this as a contemporary political and theological issue. When I taught the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the rise and the struggle of the Palestinian church in that context, I always started with a question in my first day of class. And you might do this, we don't have time, but where, when, and why did the modern Israeli-Palestinian struggle begin? Where, when, and why? And you might just quickly answer the where. Did it start in Palestine? Most of our political analysis, yes, says that. Some say 1967, others 1948. Others might say the Balfour Declaration, that gets closer. But what I would like to point out, the struggle between Zionism and the Palestinians begins in Europe, in Eastern Europe in the 19th century, with anti-Semitism. So the answer for me is Eastern Europe, 19th century, and anti-Semitism fuels it. We know that Palestinian Muslims, Christians, and Jews were basically getting along in Palestine in the 1890s and until 1920. They attended each other's holidays, Christmas. They exchanged gifts in the Eid, and for Shabbat, they were often present at the Passover. So families got along. Yes, there would be squabbles, there would be problems, but basically it was not a major political issue until the rise of Zionism. And I want to point out this is not a religious issue, but religion is used to bathe and undermine and sell the political issue here. And until there's a political solution, we will not have an end to this struggle. And I like to use the term struggle rather than conflict, because conflict implies these two equal sides here. It's never been equal. Zionism has always had the empire behind it. So next slide, let's turn now to some of the rise of Christian Zionism. Some scholars go back to the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, and the rise of millennialism. I'd rather focus on when Christian Zionism and this millennial theology becomes political. And one of the first persons we see that states that is Lord Shaftesbury. He was a member of the Clapham sect. You may remember Wilberforce, who was part of that sect that ended slavery in England. It was a group of evangelicals who lobbied Congress for certain issues. And for Shaftesbury, he was a restorationist. He believed that if the empire, that if Britain could bring Jews back to the Holy Land and convert them to Christianity, it would bring on Jesus' second coming. So they call it restorationism. And he was the one in 1839 who published a monograph, and in it he said the following: "A country without a nation in need of a nation without a country." That may have a familiar ring to you. That was picked up by the Zionist movement. A land of no people for a people with no land, which became the mantra, the selling point for Zionism. So the roots of that are Christian Zionists. And often there is a strong streak of anti-Semitism in this. Many of the British and other advocates of anti-Semitism wanted to settle the Jewish question and anti-Semitism not in Britain. Balfour rejected the immigration of Jews in 1901 when that bill came up in Parliament, but they wanted to settle that in another country. So that is also a dimension, and the Christian Zionist scenario is also very anti-Semitic. If we have time, I can explain this more. Next slide. One of the great advocates of a political form of Christian Zionism was the chaplain to the British troops in Austria, Reverend William Heckler, an Anglican. He was a premillennialist. He followed the end-time theology that developed with John Nelson Darby and advanced with others. This is the rapture, the Battle of Armageddon in the end times. This was his theology. But when he heard that Theodor Herzl was writing and talking about the Zionist movement, he befriended Herzl and offered his services. And he was quite well connected. He introduced Herzl to the Ottoman Caliph, and in the meeting, Herzl requested of the Caliph a land for the Jewish people, and he was turned down, of course. They also tried Kaiser Wilhelm's family, and they were rejected. There's speculation, but no real authority, that Herzl was introduced to Balfour indirectly through chaplain William Heckler. But Christian Zionism, in this way, is showing its political support for Zionism. And this is the alliance in the 19th century that I want to point out. This is where it begins. And the political form of Christian Zionism is what emerges in the 1880s, 1890s. And it's firmly demonstrated with Heckler and Herzl. Next slide. To underscore the anti-Semitism question, the Dr. Leo Pinsker was the beloved physician in Odessa, which is today in the Ukraine. He was an assimilationist, which most Jews were in those days. And as an assimilationist, the Jewish community was trying to fit in, not to raise many political questions, but just to be part of society. In 1881, the Tsar blamed the Jews for an economic collapse in the whole Russian Empire. Pogroms began to spread quickly all through the region, and Pinsker's house was burned that night, with people shouting against the Jews, get the Jews out, remove them, kill the Jews. He recognized at that point that we as Jews will never be safe in Eastern Europe. He wrote a monograph called Auto-Emancipation, where he applied a medical analysis to the problem of anti-Semitism, saying it's a disease. It's an incurable European disease. The only answer is for Jews to have their own state. So that represents kind of the seed. He's called a proto-Zionist before the actual Zionist movement. Next slide. But of course, we're familiar with Theodor Herzl. Herzl was a playwright who turned to journalism, and he covered the famous Dreyfus trial in Paris for a Viennese newspaper. And the trial was the framing of a lieutenant colonel named Dreyfus. He was Jewish, and it was clear it was a kangaroo court and a severe, serious injustice with the court's decision to court-martial the lieutenant colonel. Herzl saw through it, he saw the injustice, but what struck him was when he walked out of the court, there were crowds in Paris, the most progressive city in Europe, saying, get the dirty Jews out, remove the Jews, kill them. And this struck him that we as Jews will never be safe. So this is where he began to turn his entire career to Zionism. And in 1897, he convened the First World Zionist Congress, and Zionism became kind of a political movement that was very small and tiny, but it was in search of an empire to support it. Next. So what Herzl was able to formulate in 1897, when he convened the First World Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, was a vision for a Jewish state. They often tried to soften it because they had to sell their program. But behind this call for a Jewish state was a strong sense of colonialism. We need a colonial empire to back us because we're tiny. But our goal, our plan is a state. And initially they were casting around. Herzl, in fact, proposed Uganda. There were many other places, even Arizona was discussed, Argentina. But some of the early Zionist fathers said, no, it can only be in Palestine, and that's what they settled. Now, the population ratio in Palestine at that point was 94% Palestinian, Muslim, and Christian, only 5% Jewish. So it's clear they had a problem, but their vision was that they would force the Palestinians to leave, step by step, inch by inch, village by village. And his own quotes in his diary reveal this. And here's one: we must expropriate gently the private property of the state assigned to us. We shall spirit the penniless population across the border. by procuring employment for it in the transit countries while denying it employment in our own country. So there's the vision. That's expulsion, erasure. So, here, I'm sorry, I'm getting a phone call. I have to shut my phone off. Sorry about that. In Herzl's first novel, it's even more clear. He said, if I wish to substitute a new building for an old one, I must demolish before I construct. So Zionism was very clearly a movement of erasure, of slowly moving the majority population out and taking it over for themselves. Next slide. Now, in order to achieve it, they needed an empire or an imperial power to back them. As I said, they failed with the Turks, they failed with the Kaiser, but they were introduced to the British, and Lord Balfour, who was a Tory, a conservative, was also a Christian Zionist. He had a vision for the return of the Jews and the return of Jesus and how the British might facilitate that plan. But he also saw the colonial possibilities of having a Jewish state that would facilitate Zionist plans, but also the empire's plans. So the Zionist lobby put a lot of pressure on not only Balfour, but Parliament. They went through several texts, and finally, the text we're familiar with, the Balfour Declaration, is what was issued November 2nd, 1917. His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, of their rights and political status, nor the rights and political status of Jews in any other country. Now, we could spend a lot of time on this, as analysts have done. Books have been written on it. But you see, Palestinians, the majority population, 90% at that time, November 1917, Palestinians were not even mentioned by name. A Jewish national home was mentioned. Always it was intended to be a state, and that the British would facilitate that possibility. This declaration was written into the Treaty of Versailles, the treaties that settled World War II. So there was a favoritism toward not only the Balfour Declaration, but Zionism, and even the Jewish land force was mentioned to facilitate the facilitation of the purchase of property for Zionists alone. That was in the Treaty of Versailles. Next. So the British goals were not just a Jewish state in Palestine, but they envisioned a land bridge from the Levant in the Eastern Mediterranean all the way over to the jewel in the crown. What's the jewel in the crown? India. Another rationale they had was oil was just recently discovered in Arabia and in other parts of that region, Iraq, Kuwait. So the British wanted to control the oil for their empire. Third, a Jewish homeland would satisfy the Zionist lobby, but also the Christian Zionist pressure. And in order to facilitate this, the British made three conflicting promises, which I'll briefly mention. The McMahon correspondence reveals a promise to the Arabs to get them to fight with the British to defeat the Ottoman Empire, that the Arab territories would be independent, and that included Palestine. So these promises were made by McMahon and carried by Lawrence of Arabia to Hussein, who rallied the Arabs fighting with the British to defeat the Ottoman. There were 3 exclusionary zones. One was a tiny region, Alexandretta, which is between Turkey and Syria. A second was Aden, which is Yemen today. And the third was Kuwait, which was already promised to the Sabah family by the British. Otherwise, all of that region was promised to the Arabs to be free and independent. And of course, it didn't happen. The second promise was to the Zionist movement, that they would get a state in Palestine. It would not be independently Arab. But the third promise was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was a secret agreement initially between the French and the British, and that was that France and Britain would divide up the whole region. You in Lebanon know that story, as Syria, Lebanon was French. Britain received Palestine, but also Iraq, and of course later Egypt. So they had their empire right across the Arab territory to the jewel in the crown. Next. So here Zionism becomes a political movement facilitated by the empire. Zionist goals were to create not just a Jewish homeland, but a Jewish state in Palestine. And to do that, they would need to colonize it. And inch by inch, they would drive the indigenous Palestinians out. That was the goal, the vision, and that began in the 1920s. The Balfour Declaration gave the Zionist movement its first political legitimacy, ratified then in the Treaty of Versailles. Palestinians were left out. The majority population was virtually ignored by the British in terms of any political solution. And here is where the problem accelerates. Next slide. Balfour and the British commitment is underscored by Balfour gave a speech, and it kind of reveals his racism, his commitment to Zionism, where he said, "The great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions." That's the Bible. "In present needs," that's the Jewish Zionist needs, "in future hopes of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land." So you see, the vision was, we don't care about the majority population, even though the Wilson principles, which were to govern the disposition of the Ottoman territories, said there should be independence for the majority territories. The British completely violated that in handing Palestine over to the Zionist movement. Next slide. So of course then we experience an Arab uprising against the Zionists and the British, where the British defeated them soundly in 1937 to 39, exiled many of the Palestinian leaders out of the country and killed the majority. Then comes the Holocaust. And finally, there's the decision on the Jewish state. We can go back if there are questions about how that happened. And it was heavily lobbied by the US and the British to support a Jewish state. And on November 29th, 1947, the newly created United Nations decided to partition Palestine. And rather than there being one state, which the Palestinian Arabs preferred, and many others, the United States and Britain lobbied for a partition, for the creation of a Jewish state, where the Zionist state got 54 to 55% of the land and the best land, and the Palestinians rightly rejected that. Shortly after that, you had what we know as the Nakba, the catastrophe, where Zionist militias and then the newly formed Israeli Defense Forces drove out 750,000 Palestinians, half the population literally, and distributed them into refugee camps around the Arab world, including Lebanon, the West Bank, Syria, and even Iraq and Egypt. So that catastrophe began as a result of the whole Zionist movement and the British facilitation of the project, and that catastrophe has never ended. And what we see in Gaza is the latest phase of it. Next. So, just to touch on Gaza, the Green Territory is where Palestinians had cities and villages where they lived, and the Nakba of 48 drove them into this tiny district called Gaza, which was a sleepy territory with maybe 50, 60,000 Palestinians living there. And overnight, within a year, there were 350 to 375,000 refugees. And Gaza has been home to them ever since. Next slide. Now, I've found one of the best ways to interpret this whole process, this colonization, is settler colonial analysis, which is a recent field of study that was pioneered in Australia, but it basically compares what traditional colonialism is to this new form of colonialism, which we find in the 19th century. Traditional colonialism, you might look at India, where Britain colonized, took the resources, controlled the country, killed and discriminated against the indigenous people, but eventually they were driven out. And this is what happened to the French in Algeria, other European countries in Africa, in Latin America. Eventually, the country, the occupier, is driven out, goes bankrupt, and leaves. That's traditional colonialism. Settler colonialism is more ruthless. In settler colonialism, the intent of the colonizer is to stay. They never leave. In fact, the colonizer replaces the indigenous people. And this is the vision of Zionism: to erase the indigenous Palestinians, transfer them, kill them through war, whatever possibilities. And their vision when they come to a country is what this analysis calls terra nullius, which is Latin for empty land. A land of no people for a people with no land, the Zionist mantra. And of course, the United States did this to our indigenous people here. Many other examples: South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, there's many. So settler colonialism is what we see Zionism imposing on Palestine. And of course, Netanyahu can look and say, hey, you did it in America, support us. We're just like you. Okay, next slide. Let me turn now to a few biblical, theological, and hermeneutical issues as we move toward conclusion. In the Zionist movement, oh my God, here's my phone again. Okay, now it's off. Sorry about that. In the Zionist narrative, they view a tribal god, often it's Yahweh in the text, who replaces Elohim, who is the creator God. And Elohim, the Elohim texts, such as the first chapter of Genesis, say we are all created equally in the image of God. But the tribal god, Elohim, in the early texts, favors a chosen people, which are the Jewish people. So there's a favoritism, exclusionary favoritism given. And often that tribal god we see in texts in Joshua and Judges leads the people into battle to defeat the enemy. And you even have a hint of genocide. Well, more than a hint of genocide in the book of Joshua. In fact, settlers today in Israel and on the West Bank are quoting sections of Joshua about erase. Netanyahu used it, annihilate Amalek. So this whole idea where Amalek is now in this Jewish mythology, Zionist mythology, the Palestinians, Amalek must be annihilated. In 1 Samuel 15, you see it clearly, where Samuel the prophet anoints Saul to be king, and the first test that Saul is given to annihilate Amalek. And it's every man, woman, child, livestock. And when Netanyahu cited this on October 8th as justification for the genocidal war that Israel undertook, the extremist millennial settlers knew exactly what he was talking about. Annihilate everyone. All the civilians must go. And of course, Christian Zionists, in their literal interpretation, supported that. So the modern state of Israel, with the Christian Zionists, use these extremist texts biblically to create justification and to ensure their settler colonial project. And the way to counter this is to turn to the prophets and Jesus. And I'll make a few references in a moment. That's where our hermeneutic lies. Next. So the Zionist narrative, to simplify it, is three-legged, where Israel, the state, is at the top and runs through all dimensions of this triangular relationship. The land must be Zionist and controlled by Israel and the Jewish people and favor the people. The people must be loyal and faithful to the nation state and the Zionist vision. You see, what's missing in this triangle, or is marginalized, is God. Torah. Torah is secondary. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet land. Well, that's marginalized. It all can be justified for the Zionist project of a nation state. So that's a simple summary of the danger. And the greatest danger is the state can become an idol. And this, I think, is what we find going on today with the Zionist project, the extreme forms of Zionism with Netanyahu and the settler colonial project and the Christian Zionist support of it. There are many forms of Zionism. When I taught this, I taught 5, 6 different forms. There's a humanist type of Zionism that Martin Buber and many others taught. Judah Magnus, who was president, called for a binational state, one binational state. That has all been eclipsed by what Zionism has become today as a dangerous, idolatrous nation state. Next slide. To simplify, the prophetic biblical perspective is very different. At the top and running all through the triangular relationship is God. Submission to God alone. There are no idols. The land is a gift from God. The land is given through the covenant, not as an end unto itself, but as a gift by which the people will be faithful and serve God. I will bless you and give you this land. It's not an exclusive gift to exploit and to take over and to expel other people. The people then are equal under God. You must even, as the commands say, treat the sojourner in your midst with dignity. Honor the foreigner. So there are biblical texts that run throughout even the Torah and the prophets that correct the distortions of what Zionism and Christian Zionism are teaching. And a key principle in this is the land can be lost. The most graphic version of it is in Leviticus 18:28. If you violate the Torah, the land itself will vomit you out. Check out that text. It's a graphic form that if you violate God's law, turn to idols, be it the state, Baal, whatever, the land can be lost. So God must be honored and respected, and Jesus calls us back to this, as do the Hebrew prophets, and warn us about the dangers of idolatry. Next slide. Yeah, we don't have time to. This is another form of Christian Zionism I'll have to talk about in the Q&A, and that is the mainline liberal Christian Zionism that grew out of the post-Holocaust period, which doesn't have the end-time theology, the restorationism, but is a type of Zionism because it favors Zionism and Israel as the chosen people at the expense of justice. And the great theologian Reinhold Niebuhr is an example of that. We have many today, and this is a movement that's rampant in our mainline churches. So we can come back and discuss that. Next slide. So finally, the call to solidarity, the call to the church. Mitri Rahab, a great theologian who's was a pastor at Christmas Lutheran Church before Munther Isaac, and now is the president of Dar al-Khalima College, or university now. He summarized it. In Palestine, we are occupied by the Bible and Israel. This false understanding of the Bible, of Christian Zionism, the false use of it by the Zionist movement, is occupying us in a lethal, destructive way. But also, Israel is facilitating it. Then Munther's call to the poor. Where is God during this genocide? God is under the rubble. And that's where we should be. We should be with the victims, demanding justice. The Kairos Palestine document, published in 2009, was a clear call to the poor. It was a call to love, but a call to justice, so that the parties will move to dignity, freedom, equality in the land, and live together. Now, Kairos today is calling the church globally to costly solidarity, they say, in the face of this brutal occupation and even genocide. We call out Christian groups who openly support Israel in its colonial policies and its continuous occupation, and who use the Bible to give it theological justification. In doing so, they deny the truth and credibility of the gospel and advance apartheid. And one of the antidotes is Palestinian liberation theology. And I found myself moving closer to this theology as Naim Atik, Munther Isaac, Mitri Raheb, the Kairos Palestine Project, and many young Palestinians are reviving their faith by this call to justice, resistance. Matthew 25, where were you when I was hungry? Did you give me bread? Think of the children in Gaza. When I was thirsty, did you give me drink? We can't even as churches support a ceasefire to get humanitarian aid and to save a starving population in Gaza? This is the call to solidarity with the poor. Even though you did it to the least of them, you did it to me, Jesus says. This is our call, the antidote to Christian Zionism and Zionism. Next slide. A few of the things that you might consider doing. I know I'm going a little overtime here, I'll be brief. Are our seminaries training tomorrow's pastors and theologians with a theology that critiques Christian Zionism and provides the hermeneutical resources for the parish? Our denominations need to pass resolutions to provide training for clergy, future theologians, and the laity in local churches. How do we interpret the Bible? Many of our hymns talk about Zionism, Israel. We need to show that Israel in the Bible has four meanings, and it is never a future Zionist political state. Our liturgical prayers often hearken Israel and Zion, and we have to interpret that so that people know we're not supporting a modern Zionist state, but a biblical idea. Our curriculum, even for children, can sensitively introduce these themes to de-Zionize the Bible and teach our hymns, even our Christmas carols, O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel. That's not Israel today. How do we explore with Christian theologians, clergy, to challenge Christian television, which is dominated by Christian Zionism, Christian radio, Christian publishing, even Christian journals like Christianity Today and Christian Century. And finally, we need to analyze the rapid rise of Christian Zionism, its political form, how it's used by members of our own Congress and Senate in the United States, around the world, to support Christian Zionist and Zionist ideas at the expense of justice for Palestine and to prevent a future political settlement. So these are just a few thoughts. From what I know, only 2 seminaries are working on this. One is Harvard, one is Pittsburgh seminaries. So we need to get our seminaries to address this. And you at Nest are probably far ahead of the others. So now to move to conclusion. Next. The great theologian Walter Brueggemann said in his little monograph, Chosen, with a question mark, it will not do for Christian readers of the Bible to reduce the Bible to an ideological prop for the state of Israel, as though support for Israel were a final outcome of biblical testimony. So that's a call to de-Zionize the Bible. Next. We'll have to skip that. Maybe we can come back to that. I'll move to the next slide, please. One of my favorite texts that really pulled this together is from Acts chapter 1, where Luke talks about the ascension, where Jesus gathers his disciples together before he leaves them. And the text says, when they came together, a couple of disciples asked Jesus, Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom to Israel? That was a zealot question. which today would be a Zionist, militant Zionist question. Are you going to support us now to overthrow Rome? Do you support the Zealot project? Fight the Romans, defeat them militarily. And Jesus is kind of harsh with them. He says, it's not for you to know the times or the periods that the Father has set by his own authority. In other words, don't turn the Bible into this end-time prophetic prediction. Don't use these limited military strategies, but it's for you to be my witnesses. When you receive the Holy Spirit, you will be my witnesses in all Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And that was a call to go back to the difficult places to the disciples, to Jerusalem, the city of crucifixion, and live justice, live love in the difficult places. It's as if the disciples were saying, well, Jesus, we loved your teachings. The parables were great. The healings were marvelous. Lazarus, you outdid yourself. But now, are you going to do the big one? Are you going to overthrow Rome? And Jesus says, no, you've missed the point. You are to be my disciples to live love and justice. Final slide. And again, Jesus' parable of the unjust judge, I think, captures it all. A poor widow comes before a judge who respects neither God nor humanity. And this is what we have in the Israeli courts, even in the U.S. in many ways. So this widow who was powerless, she represents the poor, the victims, the people of Gaza today. And the judge responds, no, get rid of her. But the woman keeps coming, knocking on the door. And she wears the judge down because of her steadfastness. Samud, she never gives up. And finally the judge says, she has worn me down. Give her justice. Give her justice. And it's that steadfastness that we often are missing. We give up too quickly. We lose sight of the gospel, of the command. So we must be God's feet, God's eyes, the witnesses, Jerusalem, Judea, the ends of the earth, to bring justice and peace in the most difficult places today, including Palestine. Thank you very much.
Good job. Good job. Great.
Okay, we can take questions now.
Thank you very much for this very exciting, challenging, and thought-provoking presentation. It is time for our participants to voice their questions and comments. So please, those who have questions, raise your hand. Anybody? Please, Reverend Isa, Dr. Isa, would you come to the microphone?
Thank you for this very important lecture. Yesterday I gave a similar one. I'm a specialist in the Old Testament, and I worked a lot on religious fundamentalism in Christianity and in Islam. We have a lot of genuine material similar to what you said. Personally, I wrote it in Arabic, and I have a problem that there is no publisher. If you can help to put this material in English and publish it in Europe and in the Americas, this is one. And I say also a word to our congregation in the Middle East. We are thankful to the Western theologians who are defending this issue, but also it is our responsibility in the Middle East, and I urge the Protestant Church, the National Synod, the Lutheran Church, the Anglican Church, all those who are against the Christian Zionism, to organize their efforts and to do something in the Middle East. And this will be a witness to Jesus Christ and to the justice of the gospel. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for those comments. I think in terms of the publication, it's a struggle here, but I think the President George could give you my email at least, and we can be in touch and explore this together. I have other friends who have contact with I don't know, some possibilities for publication. Of course, it'll have to be translated here, but I think our friends at Sabeel and Kairos Palestine can also help you get this translated into Arabic, because we also have a need for it to be in Arabic. And yeah, it's really essential that we also get our seminaries and denominations to work on this. As we speak today, there are Christian Zionism resolutions in front of the Episcopal Church USA and the Presbyterian General Assembly. Even as we speak, they're debating Christian Zionism. I hope they adopt it. There are 5 denominations in the U.S., and you can study these, who have adopted some form of a rejection of Christian Zionism. These 2 current resolutions are updating those. The Episcopal Church, the Presbyterians, I think maybe the Mennonites, the Lutherans, the United Church of Christ already have resolutions. So you can study those. But perhaps your synod, Syria, Lebanon, could take this up and also then provide resources for seminaries, for the laity, and for pastors. So thank you for raising this question, and I'm available to communicate and share with you with my limited ability to try to get something published.
Well, I have a question to you, Don. You spoke about the genesis of Christian Zionism and the motivation behind it being on a side of faith and theology, premillennial ideas, end of times imagination, and coupled with colonial aspirations. Today, what is keeping Christian Zionism going? I mean, premillennialism and end of times and colonial aspirations, we are supposing have diminished or disappeared, or well, they're not as prominent as they used to be in the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. So what, in your opinion today, keeps Christian Zionism fueled?
Okay, very good question. Thank you for that. I think one is the extreme type of Zionism that Netanyahu represents in Israel. That's fueling it with many members of Congress in the U.S. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, is a dyed-in-the-wool Christian Zionist. So they use it really to recruit and support others, but to advance this militant version of Zionism, which is very dangerous, that we see in the genocide in Gaza now, which I fear can spread to the West Bank very quickly. So that's one. Second, fear. Fear drives this theology. Fear of what's going to happen in the end times, but fear that drives us to this authoritarianism of regimes, of Trump. Trump manipulates and gains support from some of the members of Congress, and then he raises these issues. He's not a religious person. He's a manipulator, a liar. But he will use this, as will some of his followers, to play on the fear of the average person that things are falling apart. Then we have a number of churches where poorly trained often pastors fall into this. It's a very simplistic, fear-based, black and white theology. It's racist, it's anti-Semitic at its core, and they play on all those fears. And it has grown in a lot of the fundamentalist wing of evangelicalism. And sadly, people are now, there's movements, particularly among young evangelicals, leaving the church, leaving Christianity, because they find this bankrupt. So that's where we have to get back, I think, to Jesus, the prophets, and show them an alternative. But those are it's simplistic, it's marketable quite easily, as Zionism has often done, a land with no people for people with no land. Well, that makes a lot of sense if you don't know what actually is going on. So it's simple answers, it's fear-based, it's political, and it's a heresy. And we need to really stand up and critique it for what it is. So thank you. I hope that's at least a few ideas. Oh, and by the way, it's very authoritarian. So the rise of authoritarianism plays into this as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Sabra?
Yeah, thank you, Don, for this very comprehensive lecture. I want to go back to something you passed over very quickly and said maybe we'll discuss it in the question and answer period. We would like to know more about what you call the mainline theologians and the liberal theologians, some of whom have a form of Zionist positions. These are the people that we read here. I mean, we don't read the Christian Zionists. We attack that and we criticize it as you did. But the people we read are Karl Barth and Moltmann and Niebuhr, Berkhoff, and many of these are Zionists in a sense. Can you say more about whether what their position is based on, whether they have one argument that they share, or there are several arguments that they employ?
Oh, thank you, George, so much for that question. I should have given it more time, and we don't have much time, but I'll be very brief on it. It's a totally different theology. It grew out of the Holocaust and is very understandable in that way. So it's a post-Holocaust type of theology that says that due to the Holocaust and this terrible suffering of the Jews, which we all agree, 6 million plus, many of whom were not Jews, of course, like Bonhoeffer, but this gave rise to what is the answer to the Holocaust? And for them, the answer was Zionism and the state of Israel. And Niebuhr is a perfect example of that. Niebuhr broke with the Christian Century in the 1940s because the Christian Century was proposing a single state at that point. So he created a very liberal journal called Christianity in Crisis. He also created a lobby where he lobbied President Truman and the Protestant churches, who were all on board, calling for a partition of Palestine and a Jewish state. So he supported the partition idea as an answer to the Holocaust. And his basic theology was to say, we as Christians bear the weight of anti-Semitism through the centuries, and a lot of, we can assuage our guilt by supporting a Jewish state in Palestine without thinking of the consequences of that. He was alerted that there is something terrible going on in 1948 after Deir Yassin, that Zionist militias were massacring Palestinians. Many are being driven out. And Niebuhr responded that said, well, this will be necessary for Israel to be secure. So you see the favoritism, the exclusive support of Zionism and the Zionist Project Israel, without talking about justice for all. Mark Ellis, who just recently died, and it was a great loss, a great Jewish liberation theologian, coined the phrase, the ecumenical deal, where, and this is true for mainline Protestants and Catholics, where we have dialogues with the Jewish Federation and the Zionist organizations, and it's a very good project. We have dinners, we build good relationships, but then when it comes to Palestine, we are told, don't raise that issue. It's too controversial, it's so complex, let us take care of it as Jews, as Israel. No. So the ecumenical deal is to silence the church. And that's going on now, where the Zionist organizations and even many theologians with this theology are saying, no, we have to let Israel finish the project. They need to annihilate Hamas completely. And many of our congressmen fall into that, some with religious, others with political reasons. And they miss the whole point of justice for all and serving the poorest of the poor, the hungry, the broken, and so on. So very quickly, there's many theologians. I personally find that our Christian journals, both Christianity Today, Evangelical, and the Christian Century, are dominated by this theology. There's some cracks that are showing signs of hope in Christian Century. But no, it's more of this end time theology. Daryl's holding up the link, which I don't know why.
Well, because the whole thing is the time for pious words is over, Gaza and the church. It's calling to task the church, and one of the statements is by Alan Busak of South Africa.
Okay, thank you, Daryl. So there's a nice alternative, current issue of the link. And there are many theologians. Walter Brueggemann has shifted his position to justice. His early book on the land of 1976 really had a hint of liberal Zionism in it. Others are awakening. So I think the work of Sabeel, of Mitri Raheb, of Kairos Palestine, and there are movements in all of our denominations now. We call them the PIN groups. Palestine-Israel networks. We have a Presbyterian one. There's United Church of Christ. Lutherans have their own. The Episcopal have a PIN group. They are working on justice and a different theology. And Harvard Divinity School is doing a great job on dealing with Christian Zionism in these different forms and helping their students and faculty come to grips with it. So it's a very important question. I didn't do it justice, but that's just a start. So thank you, George.
Thank you. Dr. Isa, again.
You just mentioned a part of my question about the activity of Harvard University and other universities that are working on this issue. But here we heard just at the beginning of the events in Gaza that the police in the United States is crushing any movement pro-Gaza. So we hear something a little bit contradictory to what we heard here just in the beginning. Can you clarify this question? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, it's true that I think one of the great hopeful signs in this tragedy of the genocide in Gaza has been what's happened on campuses. Students and faculty have organized these encampments all over the country. It started at Columbia at the end of April, and then it spread quickly all over the country. And these were very courageous. And a lot of pressure was put on them. You may remember the president of Columbia, of Harvard, and Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania, were brought before Congress. And they were reamed out and vilified by the Congress people of saying, crack down, bring in the police, end these resistant pockets in your schools. And the president of Harvard and the rest they followed that, but not in every case. It was very different at Brown and many other universities, where the police did not crack down and destroy. But I tell you, these protests are not going to go away. They're going to be back in September. These students are not going to give up, nor will the faculty who supported them. And there are resolutions in front of many universities to support boycott and divestment. So we'll see where this goes. But the pro-Israel lobby played a major hand in this, in putting that pressure on Congress and on the universities to do that. Harvard Divinity School is trying to hold on. They're under a lot of pressure, but they're trying to raise these issues theologically in different ways. And I know Pittsburgh Seminary is doing the same. I hope Daryl and my alma mater, Princeton Theological Seminary, will follow. So this is a grassroots movement that has to be supported. And it's a struggle because, the Zionist movement and our Zionist members of the Congress have a great deal of power at the top to put pressure on administrations, but they don't control what's going on the ground at the grassroots. And that's where these students and progressive faculty are a ray of hope, as well as in the streets, movements like Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now. Young Jews are leading the resistance. Young Muslims, American Muslims for Palestine. And we need more of our churches to stand with them. So it's not going to go away, but it's a difficult struggle here in the States on that front. So I hope that at least was a start to an answer.
Hala, please.
I want to ask thank you first for the very comprehensive presentation. I want to ask about if you can share with us some voices from your churches, regular people, not theologians, not people who really understand and read, but people are regular people, normal people. They know the Bible, they are part of church community. What do you think are the most challenging thing for them concerning the Gaza and Palestine conflict, and at the same time justice issue? If you can, thank you.
Okay. I'll try. I'm finding young Palestinians to be providing some of this hopeful analysis. And there's a group called Al-Shabaka, which is young Palestinian and Lebanese and a few Western academics who are writing. You can look that up. In my presentation and the resources, I listed a really good monograph analyzing Christian Zionism and nationalism from Al-Shabaka, so you can get that off the presentation. These movements I mentioned in the churches, the PIN groups, Daryl and I have been active with the Presbyterian Israeli Palestinian Mission Network, and this is mostly lay people, some pastors, but we are trying to educate our local congregations. You know, we pass resolutions, but they don't filter down to the local church, and this is where we really need the laity. We also have younger Presbyterians involved, and some of the new leadership are young laity in our Presbyterian. The Episcopalians would see the same. So there are movements here, but again, the students, you know, these students are at the universities, but also some at seminaries. We're involved in these demonstrations, and they haven't written much, but every now and then I come across it. So things are percolating at the grassroots. So I mean, that's the best I could do. There are also some pastors who are breaking away from these Christian Zionist kind of congregations and stepping out. So I think we're going to see more and more. I know there's a movement of young evangelicals against Christian Zionism and against this authoritarianism, Trump-type lines of politics. So I think we're going to see and hear more from that, I hope. So that's not a very good answer, so, but that's just a start.
Any pressing questions or comments from the group before we end the session?
Daryl has one.
Oh.
No, I have to leave. I'm very sorry.
Oh, okay.
But I find that when I do my Tuesday night Bible studies on the current Gospel of Mark, it certainly provides space to bring in these issues of the God of peace and justice and what the gospel that Jesus told about in the first chapter is about. The kingdom of God is a kingdom that makes us all equal in God's sight. Nobody over anybody else. Yeah.
Thank you, Daryl.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry to leave. Thank you.
Don, thank you very much for providing us with plenty of material for our continued discussion, for encouraging us to continue in educating our clergy and students here at Nest also in this way. Thank you a lot for your time, and we say goodbye, and we hope to hear from you again at another opportunity. One round of applause maybe to say a big thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an honor to be with you. Thank you for your patience and listening, and feel free to contact me. You know, I'd be happy to respond and be as helpful as I can. So God bless you all. May the power and strength of Jesus and the love of God go with you all.
Thank you.
Peace,
thank you.
Justice, and Samud.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.